Well, hey there, welcome back. So last week we started a new series, just a short one, on looking at some verses that are very often taken out of context, and particularly ones that, when used out of context, can have pretty detrimental outcomes. And we saw one last week around the issue of divorce. And so the way that, divorce can be just universally forbidden in all circumstances based on a very simplistic reading of 1 Corinthians 7:10. So there are numerous examples throughout our Bibles of these, and I just want to pick out a couple that I think just really sort of stand out as being particularly wrongly used, particularly wrongly applied, and probably some of the most well-known ones. And so we saw that one last week about divorce, and what I want to look at today is one that Christians and non-Christians alike would be familiar with, because it's almost become sort of a pithy saying. It's not even so much a verse anymore, rather than it's almost just sort of a statement of faith, or it's just almost a mantra in some people's lives. And so again, you would have heard it before. It's the one that says that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, where this particularly gets applied is in what we call the prosperity gospel. Now, you might have heard of the prosperity gospel. And look, it's not my intention on this show ever to disparage the church or to disparage Christians. I'm not interested in doing that. But if I was to say anything critical about an element of the church, this would be one of those areas, this idea of this prosperity gospel. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the basic tenets of the prosperity gospel are that faith activates blessing. If you have enough faith, you'll be blessed. Basically, faith is your credit card to all of God's goodness and all of God's glory and all of his blessings. Basically, you just need to activate your faith, and that's going to tap into all of those riches. And so it's a very, as the name would suggest, prosperity-focused message. It's God is your ultimate provision. All you need to do is tap into that, and faith is what's going to be the implement by which you do that. Now, this naturally applies to your finances, but also to good health and just to having an overall prosperous life. Very much sort of the very prosperous Western dream of having a couple of cars and a nice house and lots of money, and everything is going well for you, and you're healthy, and everything about your life is just perfect. And really, that's what God wants for you. So again, all you need to do is to have that credit card of faith that says just tap into it, and that's what's going to activate all of that blessing for you. And what this really sort of stems from is this idea that it's your divine right to have those things, that of course God would want you to be perfectly happy, perfectly healthy, and have all of the material prosperity and blessing that your heart could possibly want. That's your divine inheritance in the here and now, your best life now. That's what God intends for you, and the only barrier to that, again, is your faith. If that's not what your experience is, then clearly there's an absence there. You're missing something. You're not tapping into God properly. Maybe you've got the wrong PIN number or something that you're applying to the card, whatever it might be. Somehow you are deficient in the way that you're adequately tapping into that. And the way that you know that, again, is because things aren't going as well for you as what you expect they should be, or for what you feel like you're divinely due to have given to you. Now, of course, one of the ways that you can access this is by giving yourself, by being generous in your own giving, and that is another key to unlocking the prosperity of God. So if you give your bit, God will give you his little bit, but his little bit is so much more than your little bit, and so you've just got to be faithful with your bit, he'll be faithful with his bit, and you're going to be so much better off because of your activating faith. And one of the ways that you activate your faith, or you demonstrate your faith, is of course through your giving. It's giving more than you can necessarily afford, or what you feel necessarily convicted to give. But in doing that, in stepping out in spite of the doubts and insecurities about giving away so much, God will reward you in return for your act of faithfulness. Now, another way that you can activate this prosperity is to confess, to call it out, to declare it into being, this whole name it and claim it, the blab it and grab it kind of approach. And so again, it's a word of faith. It's a word of declare into the atmosphere, or whatever it might be, that this is something that you need or something you're entitled to. And so therefore, by that word of faith, by that confession of faith, God will give you, again, whatever your heart desires. And so this act of faith in giving and declaring, that's what's going to open up the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you can't possibly contain it. And so, of course, attendant to that is the idea that if you are experiencing poverty, if you are experiencing poor health, that must be a sign of a lack of faith. That's not something that you should necessarily, that's not something a Christian should experience. A Christian should be rich, a Christian should be blessed. And so therefore, if that's not what your experience is, there must be something that you're doing wrong. Now, again, I don't have the time to unpack all of the issues that I have with that. And it's not even to say that all of it is wrong, or that the basis of the idea of God wanting to bless his children is wrong. Of course, that is a scriptural idea, but the way that it is applied, or the way that it is interpreted or understood as playing out in your everyday life, that is, in relation to health and financial well-being, that is the sum total of what blessing actually is. It's a material, it's a health thing. That it's simply that's where I think I have a significant problem, because it's just not what the Christian experience was of people in the New Testament. The New Testament scriptures that we are drawing from are written to people who are impoverished, who are experiencing terrible health, who are living at subsistence level. And even Jesus' own experience was one of poverty. It was one of suffering. And that was certainly the case for the apostles. And so if we're going to say that that's what God wants for us now, then you have to ask the question, why didn't he want it for his own apostles, much less the first church in the first century? Again, what we see from their experience is just impoverishment, suffering, persecution, trials, the very antithesis of what the prosperity gospel teaches us that we should have. And in fact, what their experience was what we might actually deem to be a lack of faith, a lack of trust, or a lack of speaking out prosperity, or whatever it is that they wanted. They obviously didn't get that, so they obviously didn't have enough faith. I mean, even Paul's own experience was something that we would consider to be a lack of faith. And so just that in and of itself, the historical lack of understanding of the New Testaments from which scriptures are used to derive the ideas, that in and itself is very, very problematic. And so again, we could spend all day talking about this, but there's actually two verses in particular that really quite at the sort of the foundational texts for this idea of the prosperity gospel. And obviously they're taken as standalone verses. They're not even understood necessarily as verses. I mean, if somebody declares them, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, where's that from? Like, do you even have a reference for that particular verse? Or is it just a pithy statement that you live by, that somehow some mystical Christ is his sole existence is just to make your life prosperous? What do you even understand about that? So we've got these two verses. There's that one in Philippians 4:13, and the other one we have is in Philippians 4:19, which runs along similar lines. It says, "And my God will meet all your needs according to his riches of his glory in Christ Jesus." So whatever needs you might have, God wants to meet them, and God will meet them, because that's what his job is. His job is to wait for you to come to him with all of your needs and all of your desires and all of the lack that you might have. And you can do all of those things now in Christ's strength, and God will provide the resources for you, provide all of the material blessings for you that your heart should so desire, based on the combination of these two verses. And so again, you can see how very easily that could come about. You just, again, take those two verses by themselves and just apply them uniformly to whatever circumstance you might find, and that's what the mantra is, that Christ will be able to do whatever your heart desires. Obviously, it's problematic, otherwise we wouldn't be having a conversation about it today, or we wouldn't be talking about it today. But I guess the question is, what do these verses actually mean? What is actually going on in these verses? And do they still support this idea of everything that I just described? Can they still be used to support that sort of idea? And I guess you can probably anticipate the answer is no. But why is that exactly? What is actually going on? And more importantly, not so much can they support that idea? I don't think they can. But what idea are they actually putting forward? Because Paul isn't speaking in a vacuum. He's not just saying things for the sake of saying them. These verses are actually very, very powerful and very meaningful, but just not in the way that we want to use them. but they do have a message. They actually do have a very significant application to our lives, and one that is very encouraging, one that is very upbuilding, but again, not quite what we want it to mean over here. So what actually is going on with these verses, and really what is the principles that we can take from them? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. Now, as with all Bible reading, for anyone who's listened to this show even once, you know that context is absolutely essential. You cannot understand the Bible without some understanding of the context, and certainly the historical context in which it was written. So what is the context? What is the culture that Paul is actually writing to here? And as I already said, this is a time and a place where every person basically is living at what we call subsistence level poverty. Even if you have material wealth, you're one of the few that actually owns land and actually has any sort of material wealth that you don't have to worry about how to buy food because you've got money. You still are going to suffer from the many, many diseases that we just don't think about today, certainly in the West. Even if you are the wealthiest person, even if you're the emperor of Rome, you are still subject to diseases that we just don't even think about today. Malaria, typhoid, tuberculosis, these diseases were the biggest killers in the ancient world. And no amount of material wealth is going to protect you from those things simply because there was no medicine for them. There was no treatment for them. If you got them, you basically are as good as dead. So that was what everyone's experience was. And so the idea of health is really just not a reality for most people. Physical health is just not a reality. In fact, what we know from the ancient world is that your average person, your average human is about 5.5 feet tall. Now, what that indicates to us is that they were constantly malnourished. They just never had enough food, particularly through their developing years, to grow enough to be the average of today, which is 6 foot tall. And so we take for granted that we have 3 meals a day. We take for granted that we have healthy food generally that enriches us, that enables us to grow and develop. They just simply didn't have access to that. And so they didn't have access to good food, and they were constantly threatened by various diseases. So health just wasn't an option for them. It just wasn't something that they could bank on. And so the very idea of having this health that's going to make us live for years and constantly be in total health, it certainly wasn't the experience of somebody like Paul. Let's just put it that way. So then that's at least something of a cultural setting for the Christians that Paul is addressing. But what are some of this more specific elements of the sort of the relational nature that these the first Christians were experiencing? What was it that was actually informing these ideas? Well, one of the key elements to understand the letter to the Philippians, of course, we're looking at Philippians, that's where these verses come from, so we need to look at the context of Philippians. Now, this actually does draw a little bit from the series that I just finished a few weeks ago, and this was sort of the last episode. I touched on these verses, but just didn't have the time to go into them. So this is something of a recap of a few of the key points that I made through that series, but they all sort of have to come into the mix of our interpretation to really understand what's taking place in Philippians chapter 4. So the key cultural element that we need to keep in mind when we're reading this passage is the idea of relationship, or more specifically, the idea of friendship. How two people relate to one another that are of basically equal status or basically equal rank within the society. There's two very clear ways that you relate to another person in the ancient world. There's either on the vertical axis or on a horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis is where you are a client or a patron, or vice versa. So if somebody is your superior, they become your patron, they become your sponsors, your supporters, and you become their clients. You basically become their lackeys, their helpers, their servants, effectively. Or vice versa. If you're in a place of wealth, you can become a patron. If you're in a place of poverty, you become a client. Now, everybody is a patron. Everybody is at least a client to somebody, and even the most elite Romans are going to be clients to the emperor. But for everybody else, they're going to be clients to somebody above them. And that's really their sole means of support. There is no government assistance if you fall on hard times. If you have need of any sort, you turn to one of the elites in your city and they become your patron. They provide for your needs, and as a client, you then return back to them honor and esteem for what it is they've done for you. So that's one of the ways you relate. But the other way that you relate between equals, social equals, is around friendship. Now, friendship is an idea, of course, that we're familiar with. We have friends. We have people that we're in a relationship with. But how we understand friendship, I think certainly today, is much different to how it was understood in that context. You think about friends you might have just in general at church or just in general at work or just in general life. You're friends with them because you just get along with them. You have similar ideas, similar values, similar interests, and you just like their company. You connect with them, you enjoy being around them, and the friendship is an emotional connection. It's something about building each other up, and you draw from each other, you get strength from each other, you encourage each other, and it has the benefit to you of you're better as a human being because humans are relational creatures. We're created to be in relationship, and that's been true from the very start. So friendship feeds into that. It completes our humanity. It completes the nature of us as human beings. So friendship for us today is much more about that deeper existential need that we have. Friendship is just there to, again, build each other up. Friendship in the ancient world, naturally as humans in society, they would have people hang out with people that they get along with. And we certainly read about friendships like that where people just genuinely love each other. They just genuinely enjoy each other's company. But what friendship was much more clearly understood as was more quid pro quo. So if you think about friendship in a modern political sense, if you think about politicians that are, quote unquote, friends with each other, and when they stand in front of a camera, oh, this person's fantastic, this person's so wonderful, and they speak so highly of them, but actually behind the scenes they really hate each other. But it's more beneficial to be in relationship, at least to have a friendship connection, than it is to be in open enmity with each other. And the reason why it's better to be in a friendship with them is because of the benefits that come along with that. Well, they are politically positioned or socially positioned to benefit you in some way, and vice versa. You can benefit them in their political aspirations or in their social aspirations. And so you can actually serve each other better by being friends than you can be as enemies. And so the friendship is purely connected or purely based around this idea of a quid pro quo, this idea that, well, I'm friends with you because I scratch your back, you scratch my back. And so long as that relationship is maintained, we can be friends. And so on the surface, everyone will think we're best friends. In reality, we hate each other and we don't want to be spent any time in the same room together. But for the purposes of benefiting one another, we can overcome that in order to be quote unquote friends. So if you have any aspirations for public life or any sort of aspirations for social advancement, you need to have friends. It's not what you know, it's who you know, and that's an expression you would be familiar with, and that's as true today as it was back then. It's not about all what you know knowledge-wise, it's about who you know. It's about the connections you have. And so networking is absolutely essential to any sort of success in public life, which is what an elite person is aspiring to in the ancient world. You need to have friends. You need to have people that are your primary supporters. Now, the words for these, the Latin term for this is the word amici, where we get our word amicable from. So, you're amicable with somebody, it has this connotation of friendship. In the Greek, it's the word philos, and it's a word we're familiar with from things like the word philosopher, for example, a philosopher or philosophy, the friend of wisdom, or philanthropy, a friend or a lover of humanity. So the philos is this idea of being a friend or having sort of a loving connection relationship with somebody. But how it was always understood, again, was in this idea of this quid pro quo relationship. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And so long as we're doing that, so long as we're mutually benefiting one another, all is well. Now, the way that a relationship or a friendship begins is with an offer of support. So if I can see that you have a need and I have the resources to support you in that need, and you might be a wealthy person, but you might not have cash on hand. You might be very wealthy and you own a lot of land, but you don't have cash because all of your cash is tied up in the land, but you need quick money for a particular thing. Well, I can give you that money. I happen to have the cash to give you, so I can help you out in this situation. It's not that you're poor. I know you can pay me back, but right now you need my help. Now, by my offering you that isn't just I'm just helping out somebody just for the sake of it, and you'll pay me back one day. No, what that is an offer of friendship. It's so much more deeper than just simply I'm here to help out a random stranger just as an act of kindness. I actually want something in return from you. And so now by offering you that support, what I have just done, and if you accept that support, you have in fact entered into a friendship with me. You now have an obligation to me in that I've given you something which actually makes you my inferior. You are a lesser person than me now because I've got one over you, because I've lent you this money in this case. You have an obligation to your own honor to pay me back. You don't want to be stuck as being the person who's in my debt. You need to get back one over me by giving me back something in return. And there's two reasons for that. One, you need to pay me back, because if you don't, you're going to be seen as being ungrateful. Your gratitude isn't demonstrated by, oh, thank you so much, that was really kind of you. No, your gratitude is demonstrated by giving me back in kind what it is that I first given to you. If you don't do that, failure to do that will make you seem to be ungracious, and as a result of that, that's going to diminish your honor. But also, it's not just about giving me back what I first gave you, it's giving me back something and then some, because you can't have the situation where you're in my debt. You need to be back over me. You need to have something over me. So you give me something back in return, but of greater worth. You may be the same amount of money plus some interest to say that, well, now I've got one up on you. And so now I have an obligation to my own honor to give back to you and then some. And this can keep going and escalating into the point where we can bankrupt each other. But the important point is that it's not that we bankrupted ourselves, it's that we weren't outdone in gift giving. It's that we weren't outdone in reciprocation. I can be bankrupt as a result of our relationship, but I can still have the honor of never having been outdone in generosity and in gratitude. Now, that may not resonate with us, and it probably shouldn't, but in an honor-shame society, that is what makes this whole society go around. And so friendship was about, we are dependent on one another, and we are constantly in each other's debts, and we're constantly trying to outdo each other for the sake of our own honor, for the sake of our pride. Now, the same is true in the opposite way, that if I offer you support and you reject it, you've rejected my friendship. It's not just that, oh, no, thanks, I don't need your help right now. No, you've rejected my friendship. That's a big deal, because now what you've done is to say your help isn't good enough, your money's not good enough, you aren't good enough, I don't want to be in relationship with you. Well, that's a slight against me. And so now what we've created isn't friendship. In fact, what we've created is enmity. And enmity works the same way as generosity, in that, well, you've slighted me, now I need to slight you and then some, and then you back to me until we destroy each other's lives. So friendship is a messy game. Friendship is this quid pro quo, and it is much more. It needs to be understood much more in the context of a political relationship, much more than certainly just a relational or emotional friendship that we might understand it today. And so with that as a context, it gives us at least some insight then into why the New Testament never talks about friendship. Paul never talks about the relationship between Christians as one of friendship. It's just language that never actually gets used in the New Testament, or except for a couple of examples that we'll look at in just a moment. But it always, when Paul talks about the relationship between fellow Christians, he always talks about a sibling relationship. He always talks about brothers and sisters. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, it's because a brother-sister relationship, a sibling relationship, is the most intimate and the most personal and the most emotionally relational, devoted relationship you can have in the ancient world. It is, family is absolutely everything, and you literally die for your family. And so for Paul to use that as a way of describing the connection that Christians should have makes a lot of sense. But he also deliberately avoids the idea of friendship because of the social connotations that come along with that, being that if you understand a fellow Christian as a friend, it would be very easy for you to bring that cultural understanding and say, hey, you're my friend, therefore you owe me something. Therefore, we are in this relationship as a matter of reciprocity rather than service. I need to see you as somebody that I am serving with no expectation of any return, rather than a friend who I'm giving something to, knowing that or expecting that you're going to give that back to me in kind. So Paul's very deliberate about this in the way, and really the whole New Testament is very deliberate about the way that it intentionally avoids the idea of friendship or this sort of as a way of describing one another. But there's this one great example that we have, and it's another, as a sidebar, it's another verse that's quite often misunderstood, misinterpreted. And it's the one we find in James 4:4. It says, friendship with the world is enmity to God. Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend with the world becomes an enemy of God. Now, this is one of those rare times when the New Testament actually uses the word friendship to talk about the way that we should relate to somebody else. And it specifically talks about the way that we relate to the world, that we shouldn't be friends with the world. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember as a young Christian certainly maybe 20, 25 years ago, this verse was always understood as friendship with the world equals worldliness, or it equals something like secularism. If you, for example, listen to secular music, that's friendship with the world. Or if you have any sort of secular interests or secular pursuits, things that are not expressly Christian, that's friendship with the world. Basically, anything that might be deemed living according to the values of the world, that's what this verse is talking about. It's talking about any sort of friendship like that, any sort of worldliness is to now become an enemy of God. Now, of course, it was always difficult to reconcile with that, with the same idea, the same principle that was taught, which is, to be in the world but not of the world. We can't escape the world. We are part of the world, but we can't have anything to do with it. And then you ask the question, well, then how do I go to work? How do I go to school? How do I step out of my house every day into a world that is obviously not Christian and yet somehow engage it, but not in a way that makes me a friend of it? Somehow I need to remain an enemy of the world that I'm also supposed to be a part of. And at the same time, because if I don't, I'm going to become an enemy of God. Like, it is completely irreconcilable if what James is saying here is that friendship with the world is expressly secularism and therefore that makes you an enemy of God. But when we understand what an ancient person and thinks about when they use the word friendship, it actually makes a lot more sense. If friendship is this idea of this quid pro quo, I'm your friend because we mutually benefit one another. You're my friend because I scratch your back, and I'm your friend because you scratch my back. And so long as we are reciprocating, so long as we are mutually benefiting one another, that's how the friendship remains. But if at any point that mutual beneficence stops, we stop being friends. That's what the understanding of friendship was. And so what James is saying is, it's not that you have secular interests or that you might, engage with the world due to your work or due to your schooling or whatever it might be. He's not talking about that at all. What he's talking about is, where is your dependency? Who are you dependent on? Are you looking to the world for mutual support? Do you look at the world as your primary means of support? Do you see the world as being the thing that actually provides for you, or do you see that as being God? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't rely on the world and trust in the world to provide and support all your needs at the same time as have that reliance on God. It's one or the other. And so the question becomes, is a matter of dependency. Who is it that you're mutually beneficent to and from? That is who your friend is. And so the question is, if it's not God, then it must be the world. And if that's the case, what you're saying to God, in fact, is, thanks very much, God, but I actually don't need your help at all. Now, if that's your attitude, then clearly, yes, you've become an enemy of God, because you're saying to God, thanks but no thanks, I don't need you, I don't want you. And so what else can you be doing other than turning your back on God and therefore, well, making God your enemy? So Paul's very deliberate about this. He doesn't use friendship as a way of describing the Christians. And he never wants them to understand themselves as even being in friendship with one another. He wants to see them to see each other as being in a loving, agape, family, sibling relationship, which brings with it a whole different set of dynamics. Well, with all of that said, you might be asking the question by this point, what has this on earth got to do with Philippians? Well, what this does is bring us back closer to our passage, because what Paul had with the Philippians was something of a mutually beneficial relationship. Paul was dependent on the Philippians for their support. And if without their support, he still would have been able to do his ministry, but it would have been a little bit harder because they had become his primary supporters. They'd become his primary benefactors in providing financial assistance for him to be able to do his ministry all along. Now, the story of this actually goes back to his initial time in Corinth when he was first there with them, and they seem to have entered into what Paul refers to in the Greek as a koinonia. And so we always translate this word koinonia as fellowship, as koinonia is the relationship, or it's one of the connecting characteristics between Christians. We're in we have a spiritual koinonia, a spiritual fellowship that brings us into relationship. And that's certainly, it's not untrue of what the word actually means. Koinonia can certainly have that connotation, but the technical term, the everyday usage of that word was much more practical. It was much more actually a business term. And so if you enter into a business partnership, what you're entering into is a koinonia. Now, in the Latin, the equivalent term is the word societas. Naturally, we'll get a word society from. Whichever language you use in it, it equates to the same thing. We are in a business partnership, which means that we have mutual obligation because we've both agreed in advance, even by a written contract, to say that this is what I'll contribute, this is what you contribute, and by combining our resources, we can produce a greater outcome than if we're just trying to work by ourselves. Typical business partnership. Anyone who's gone into a business partnership has entered into something like a koinonia or something like a societas. It's this idea of being in partnership for the mutual benefit of pooling our resources for this greater advantage. That's very different to a friendship. Friendship is quid pro quo. I've done something nice for you, you do something nice in return, and we keep doing this and until we stop. And if we do stop, we become enemies. That's not what a business partnership is. A business partnership is we've both agreed to the same contribution or whatever the contribution might be. And the only thing that what keeps this relationship in connected or humming along is that we both faithfully continue to input into it what we first agreed to put into there. So if I've said I'm going to put in X amount of money on a regular basis, that is what my contribution is, and that's what my obligation is. It's to the partnership. It's not just a reciprocal, well, I've done that for you now, so you owe me something. No, you owe the business whatever you've agreed to. I owe the business what I've agreed to, and that's how we're going to work together. Entirely different thing to an ancient friendship. And so that's what Paul has entered into. This is a koinonia that he's entered into. And what the terms of that agreement would be that the Philippians have said, we will support you financially in your ministry. On the other hand, you in return will go and preach the gospel. We want to do that, but we can't because we're here in Philippi. You can. That's what your calling is. And so your obligation, your contribution to the business is preaching the gospel, whereas ours is putting in the finances to do that. Now, the closest equivalent, you might have made the connection already, would be something like supporting a missionary. So your church supports a missionary. They are somebody who goes into a country or a place that you can't, but you've got a heart to help and to serve and to see the kingdom advance. And so you support missionaries to do that in a way that you can't yourself actually do. So you enter into an agreement, a partnership, and what comes of that agreement is that the gospel goes into that place that you yourself couldn't have done yourself. So that's what the relationship then was with the Philippians. But what had happened after a number of years, towards the end of Paul's ministry, is that he'd been arrested, he'd been brought to Rome, and now he is in a difficult situation, and in a situation where he really, really needs all the support that he can get, because Paul could at least work for himself. Paul could at least make his own money. He wasn't entirely reliant on the Philippians. He didn't want to have to work because it took time away from preaching, but it was there if he had to. When he's in prison, he can't work, and so now he is entirely dependent on any means of support that he can get. And so what the Philippians, having heard that Paul's in prison, have sent him some support. Now, they've sent that along with a guy by the name of Epaphroditus, obviously one of the Philippian leaders or someone from their church. He's come to Rome, he's brought this offering to Paul, this support to Paul, and while he's there, he's got very sick and hasn't returned. And the Philippians are like, hey, this is not good. Like they haven't, Epaphroditus hasn't come back when they expected he would have. And eventually the word has got back that he was ill. They found out that he's ill. And so now they're really worried, not just about Paul's situation. They were initially worried about Paul. That's why they sent the support. Now they're also worried about Epaphroditus. And so they send another letter to follow it up. And they say, one, to double check on how Paul's doing, but also to check on how Epaphroditus is doing and to sort of clarify, did you get the offering? Like in all of this mess, the initial intent was the offering. Did that actually get to you? And so Paul responds with our letter to the Philippians, which is to say, amongst other things, thank you for the support. Thank you. I did receive the offering. It's welcomed gratefully. And apart from the many other things he said in the 4 chapters leading up to this, he leaves this last mention of the offering to the very end. Again, he just did a whole series on it. Don't need to repeat that there. But what he does is he saves this as the last word, remembering that this letter's been read out to a congregation, and they are, they're hearing all of this instruction and encouragement that Paul's been saying. But he wants the last thing they hear in this meeting, through this sermon, this letter, the last thing that he wants them to hear is his gratitude for the offering. He wants them to understand that, he did receive it, he's very grateful, and all of that. And so chapter 4, verse 10 to 20 is this last section. It's the final word of the letter. It's the thanks, I received it, welcomed gratefully, it's all of that. And it's in that context that Paul is writing these verses that we are so famous now. These ideas of Christ, will do all things that we ask him to, and he will give us everything our heart desires. That's where these verses are coming from. Now, already, hopefully, you're starting to see that context alone doesn't necessarily support some of the conclusions we've drawn about these verses to begin with. But we also have to remember that the Philippians of all of Paul's churches were particularly impoverished. These are churches, Paul says about them later on, he's talking to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and he's talking about the Macedonians. He said, these guys are going through extreme poverty and extreme persecution. They're going through a really, really difficult time here, and they still see themselves as being blessed. Despite their poverty, despite their persecution, despite all the hardships they're facing, they actually understand themselves to be very blessed. And in fact, actually out of their gratitude to God, out of the fullness of their hearts in Christ, they're giving even more abundantly. So actually out of their suffering, actually out of their poverty, the very things, the antithesis to this prosperity message, the very thing that would indicate that you've got a total lack of faith, for them it's filled their faith and it's causing them to give even more, even though they're going through much worse circumstances than most of Paul's other churches. So that's the audience that Paul's speaking to here, people going through a very difficult time financially and just generally emotionally. So if Paul is actually saying to these guys, God really wants for you a bigger house and more cars and all of the wonderful stuff, it's not really going to work, or it's certainly, there is no real possibility for that to actually unfold. It's not the audience for that, and it's not ever going to be their reality. And so if that's what Paul intended by it, then their takeaway is we must be failing, God must be disappointed with our lack of faith, because that's not what our experience actually is. If this prosperity message is the best way to interpret the verses, which, as I said, it's not. So what is Paul actually saying by these verses? What is the intention of these in a context where, and keeping in mind, for Paul, suffering actually is to be blessed. For Paul, he will say suffering is actually a blessing. Suffering is one of the greatest things that can happen, because by suffering, we develop character. Through character, we develop hope, and hope doesn't disappoint, as he says in Romans 5 or Romans 8, anyway, somewhere in Romans. So for Paul, suffering isn't a bad thing. So already there, that's the context, that's Paul's understanding of all of this. So what does that look like then in the context of this passage? So it says in verse 10, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. So the thing that Paul is very carefully trying to do here is to walk that line between what this relationship actually is, which is a business partnership, or at least keep the Philippians focused on what it actually is, and not let it slip over to the idea of friendship. Because the practical outworking of both relationships actually looks the same. If we're in a business partnership, and this business partnership required the Philippians to give Paul money, if they were his friend, they would give Paul money. It looks exactly the same. The difference is the attitude behind the giving. What Paul wants them to do is to keep focused on the koinonia side, on the business partnership side, and not let them default or slip into the idea that perhaps actually this is a friendship and now, Paul, you owe us something. And this would be easy to do as well, because you have to remember that Paul hasn't actually been preaching. He actually hasn't been upholding his end of the bargain, which is to preach the gospel. He's been in prison. Now, he's spent the first chapter or two trying to explain to them, I've been having great opportunities to share the gospel even here in prison. So I'm still doing my end of the bargain. But it would be very easy for some cynical person in Philippi to say, well, then what are we supporting the guy for if he's not actually upholding his end of the bargain? So really, what Paul owes us something now. So you could easily imagine how somebody might start to think that way, and it wouldn't take much to push them in that direction. That's what Paul's intentionally trying to avoid here, trying to bring it back to the original terms of the agreement, which you've given me money, but let's not forget what this thing was about. And so he starts off kind of with a thank you, but more of a gratitude of you've renewed your concern for me. What do you mean you've renewed your concern for me? Well, what that means is that you have made another installment to the partnership. You have this is one of your ongoing contributions that you've been doing for a while now, and this is just another one in line with that. Nothing has changed in that respect. You've renewed your concern for me. You didn't have an opportunity before. So I'm not criticizing you for not supporting me prior. You haven't had the opportunity, but now you have, and so I'm grateful for the fact that you haven't forgotten about our original partnership, our original deal. And so this is just my encouragement is yes, it is gratitude, but it's more that you haven't forgotten about me, more that you haven't given up on me. So I'm really grateful for that. But the point being, it's still about the business partnership. It's still about this original agreement that we had. So it says in verse 11, he says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Now, already it's amazing how out of context that verse gets taken. If it's read as, I can do any great thing, any prosperous thing through Christ who strengthens me, because that's his will for my life, that he wants me to be prosperous and flourishing and healthy, wealthy, and wise and all of that. Therefore, I can do all of that because of Christ who strengthens me. The very verse before it dismisses that whole idea. So Paul's saying to me here, look, I've learned how to be content. And now this is an ambition you have in the ancient world, particularly amongst the philosophers, the idea of self-sufficiency. You don't want to be dependent on other people, because if you're dependent on other people, they're going to let you down. If you're reliant on other people to support you or to meet your needs, you're going to, that is a guaranteed way to fail. And it's still true in any society. You know, when you think about it, when you have to rely on other people, it becomes very problematic when they let you down because, well, for all of those reasons. And certainly in my case, it does force you to become a lot more autonomous. You don't want to have to rely on people. You become self-sufficient because at least you know that if it didn't work, if you failed, it's at least on you. There's no one else you can blame but yourself. Now, of course, that does create its own set of problems of failure where you can't actually meet your own needs. You can't actually fulfill all of the things that you need to do. You do actually have to rely on other people. So it's always about finding that balance. It's always about, not just being totally reliant on yourself because you can't do everything yourself. At the same time, you don't want to be completely reliant on other people because you are inevitably going to be let down. You've got to be able to do a bit of both. But for the philosophers, the goal was always the former. It's always about being self-sufficient. It's always about, okay, I am entirely reliant on myself, and if anything goes wrong, it's entirely on me. I've got nobody else to blame but myself. And so therefore, that is my disposition. That's the way that I sort of carry myself through life, is by being totally self-sufficient. And so for Paul, particularly in the nature of the ministry and life that he's been called to, it does require self-sufficiency. This is why Paul had a leather working trade, because he had to be self-sufficient. He couldn't rely on the Philippians giving him money, if only because they didn't have electronic funds transfers. They couldn't just punch money into a computer somewhere and have it turn up in Paul's bank account somewhere else. It had to actually, at the very least, travel the distance to get to Paul, and Paul was always on the move. So the money could turn up to where Paul was and it's missed Paul because he wasn't there. Like, there's no phones to call him and say, hey, where are you, Paul? We're going to send you money. It'll be there in 3 weeks. Paul's always on the move. So it's very hard to be reliant on another church, if only because of the practicalities of actually getting the money to him in the first place. I mean, Paul being in prison was probably the easiest time they had to get to Paul because he wasn't going anywhere. So you have to be much more self-sufficient, and especially when you've got a ministry like Paul's, you have to be almost entirely self-sufficient. And so Paul is saying to these guys, look, and it almost sounds like ingratitude. It almost sounds like, thanks, but I didn't really need your help at all. No, but he's trying to relativize the gift away from this, now you owe us, Paul, to Paul saying, I'm so grateful for what you've done for me, but you did it because you made a promise that you would in the first place, but also that I didn't need it, which means that I don't necessarily owe you anything in return. It was just a very nice gesture on your part. Even if it is about friendship, it was just something that you did out of an act of generosity. So again, it sounds ungrateful, but it's Paul trying to keep out of that sticky situation of this quid pro quo relationship that it could very easily slip into. But to the point of the verse, it says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Paul has literally, look at the very words before it, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Paul is saying, there are plenty of times where I'm going through impoverishment. I'm going through times of want. I'm going through times of starvation, times of homelessness, shipwrecked, all these sort of things that Paul experiences. Paul says that's part and parcel of being a minister of the gospel in this world. It is going to be an experience of suffering more than it's going to be an experience of prosperity. Now, a prosperity message would say, well, Paul doesn't have enough faith. Paul is simply not living enough, doesn't have enough faith because he says it right there. There's times where he has want. Well, Paul, you've got to declare prosperity. You've got to speak food into being. That's the problem, Paul. You just don't have enough faith to declare the resources that you need. That's why you're experiencing want. Paul says that's nothing to do with it. I go through want because that's the nature of this world that we live in, and that's the nature of the ministry that I'm called to. No, but I'm not afraid of those circumstances. I'm confident in those circumstances because I know that Christ will get me through them, whatever they are, because I'm not actually dependent on the wealth. I'm not dependent on the circumstances. I'm not dependent on the external provision. I'm only dependent on Him who's going to sustain me even when I'm starving. Even when there is no food around to be eaten, He will still sustain me through that time. He's not going to magically create bread out of nothing. He's just going to get me through my hunger. And that's all He's going to do. And that's all I actually need Him to do, is just to get me through the times of hunger. And so what I've learnt in Christ is that irrespective of my circumstances, He's still there and He's still powerful and He's still getting me through whatever the circumstances look like. Whereas again, this verse will be taken to say, well, no, this verse tells you that you must change your circumstances. You must declare that your circumstances are wrong, that somehow you're even under a curse and you need to break that curse because Christ should overcome all of those things. And so therefore change your circumstances to one of constant prosperity, one of constant health. That's the antithesis to what Paul's whole life was. And yet he will still say, no, my faith tells me that God's going to get me through it in spite of the external circumstances. So already there we can see it's completely misused, almost abused, certainly taken out of context and used in a way that even Paul, writing it in its own context, wouldn't recognize. Paul would just look at that message and go, what are you guys even talking about? That is not even a reality of the Christian life. And yet somehow my words have been used to endorse that. Absolutely crazy. But he goes on, verse 14, yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of our acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out for Macedonia, not one church shared with me, koinonia, in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need. And so again, it's to reiterate the nature of the relationship, the nature of the offering that they've just given to him. This is a business partnership we've entered into a long time ago, and this is just an extension, a continuation of what that partnership initially set out to do. And so thank you for it, but thank you for maintaining the terms of our original agreement. And in return for that, as I've just explained in the previous chapters, is that, well, I'm also still preaching the gospel, so I'm still upholding my end of the bargain as well. And so he goes on in verse 17, he says, not that I desire your gifts, what I desire is more to be credited to your account. I have received full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. They are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. So here's the formal receipt. I have received the money. It's even more than I could have hoped for. I'm well supplied now as a result of this generous gift that you've given me. Thank you very much. All of that is absolutely wonderful. So yes, it did come. I did get it. It was more than sufficient, which may have been a question that they would have asked. Did we send enough? Because they wouldn't have known. By the time any message had got to him, the circumstances would have been changed quite significantly. They don't know what Paul needs. They don't know what the situation is going on. And so this is probably an answer to a direct question. Did we send enough? And so Paul's saying, yes, thank you, absolutely more than I could have hoped for. And even if it wasn't, it's the right thing to say, right? I mean, what if you just turned around and said, oh, sorry, guys, you're still in massive debt here. I still can't afford to feed. Thanks for the nice gesture, but it really wasn't. No, of course he's not going to say that. Of course he's going to say, no, more than enough. Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful offering that you've given. Not this gift that you've given, but an offering that you've given. Because at the end of the day, who you gave this to was yes, to me, but really it was first to God, because you gave this under the terms of our agreement, which is that the gospel would go out. And so any support you've given is for him. It's your worship to him. And so again, to move this away from the idea of friendship, it is, don't look to me for repayment, look to God. Now, of course, the Philippians would know that from the terms of their agreement, but there might be some who are going, hang on a second, we've given you a lot here, Paul, and what have we got in return? Really? You've just preached the gospel? Really? That's all we get back for all of this money that we've been saying? It would be very easy for that attitude to slip in. And so Paul is again trying to avoid that. And he's saying, look, if you are looking for repayment, it's not going to come from me. That was never the agreement. Where it is going to come from, in fact, actually is God. And so Paul also recognizes their poverty. They've given out of money that they didn't have. They've given out of extreme poverty to still supply him with his needs. And that's going to make things harder for them. It's not like they're giving out of the exuberant excess that they have, which most of us in the West do. We're giving out of really just the stuff that we can spare. It doesn't actually cost us anything. It's not like, well, it's either pay the electricity bill or give this offering. I'll give the offering and hopefully the electricity bill. We don't really put ourselves in those circumstances. What Paul is saying here, that's pretty much what they've done. They've put themselves in a circumstance where we've got less than nothing. We've got almost nothing. We've just put ourselves to have less than nothing, but we've done it anyway. But we still have these needs that need to be met, like food, for example. Where is that going to be coming from? How is that need going to be met? And so Paul's saying, God will meet those needs. What Paul's point in this verse is to say, whatever needs you have in return, God will meet them. Whatever this has cost you, God will repay you. Because that's actually how giving works. It's not, you might be giving to your church and then saying, what is the church giving back in return? Well, actually, it's what God's going to give you in return, because firstly, you're giving it to him as an act of worship. It's that the church is the immediate beneficiary of that, because the church is hopefully doing the work of God. And so therefore, that's where the benefit comes from. Paul is saying the same thing here. Yes, you gave the money to me, but it's to do God's work. So really the gift was to God. And so if you're looking for anyone that's going to pay you back, it's going to be him, because he's the one who's actually the ultimate beneficiary or the recipient of this offering in the first place. But when we start to interpret this as saying, God's going to meet all my needs, which is this shopping list of stuff that actually I don't need at all. It's just nice, comfy items that I can have, or an extra TV, or whatever these needs, quote unquote, might be. They aren't actually needs, and that's certainly not the sort of needs that Paul had in mind. For them, the needs literally was food. It was basic sustenance. Paul's saying, look, I know you still have those desperate needs. God will meet those things because you first gave this to him. And so the point of this is certainly be generous, but also understand that God will repay. He won't. It's not. God's not going to come back and say, well, you gave me this little bit here, so I'm going to make you a billionaire. As a result, I'm going to give you back so much more that you don't even need, just because you gave this small bit of generosity. No, it's that you have needs. They will be met because you first trusted God, because you put your trust in him. You sort of, it cost you something. You took out of resources that would otherwise be used to meet those needs. And the response is to say, well, God will meet those needs as well. And so you will still have the needs met, plus you will also have the added bonus of giving to God and ultimately supporting the work of the kingdom. And so anyway, there's a lot more that could be said about the prosperity gospel, and I'm certainly haven't got the time or necessarily even the interest to do that. But at the very least for these two verses, they don't say what this particular doctrine makes them say. It's just not there. Or if they're being interpreted as, I can do whatever my heart desires, God will strengthen me and resource me to do whatever it is that I feel like doing. That's not what he's talking about, even in the slightest. What he's talking about here is, well, everything that we've just described that these verses are saying. And so what actually the implication or the application of this for us is that whatever your circumstances, good, bad, or otherwise, if you're in God, that's just what it is. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good, but whatever the circumstances might be, Christ is going to strengthen you through those. And if you trust him with your resources, even if it comes at an immediate cost to a particular need that you have, God sees the need, he will meet the need. The need, not the whatever your selfish heart desires, but whatever your actual needs are for, in this case, survival. Well, anyway, hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on these two very powerful verses, very, very, very powerful and very encouraging verses, but encouraging when used in the right way. Encouraging really to the reality of most of our situations, which is that we're not living 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in perfect health and wealth. We actually do go through very difficult times, genuinely hard times of poverty and sickness and just genuine distress. Those are part and parcel with living in the world that we live in. We will go through hard times. And it is not because of a lack of faith, and it's not because God is turning against us or we haven't declared enough health, wealth, and prosperity. No, it's simply just the fact of life. But the encouragement from these verses actually is God will still equip you, resource you, and sustain you through those difficult times. And so at least for me, that's a lot more encouraging. That's a lot more realistic to what the actual realities of life actually are. But anyway, I'm repeating myself. Hopefully that's been helpful. But otherwise, have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. All the best.